So we're moving on in this unit to what I call the short-term causes. Now, there were long-term causes, which we talked about in the last unit. This whole idea of the Enlightenment, cultural shifts in the colonies, um, greater control, abandonment of shelter and neglect. These are all long-term causes. These are the more immediate stuff that in the decade or so that led up to the actual war. All right, so Sugar Act. First, the headline that you definitely want to write down is the first attempt by the British to try to tax the colonists following the following the War of 18. Following the 7 Years' War, French Indian War. Essentially, what it was a tax on rum that was produced. Now, the tax itself was actually kind of light. It was continuation or extension of a tax that existed called the Molasses Act. That tax, I think, was about 6 pence, which is not very much per barrel of rum produced. This dropped it down to 3. So right there, that doesn't seem like a big deal. But here's the real problem, right? The real problem is it beefed up the British government's ability to essentially impose the tax, harsher penalties, harsher um, uh, rules, so that like if you got caught, unlike before, you really could suffer a pretty serious consequence, like losing property. We talked about this during the Navigation Acts. They're going to start really beginning to clamp down in a way they didn't before. All right, now the next thing we want to talk about is the Quartering Act. This is a pretty famous act in American history. Um, Clearly pissed off the colonists enough to put it in the Bill of Rights as something that could not be done. The short version of this is that basically the British, who were now keeping permanent soldiers in the colonies to deal with the threat of Native Americans, which was a pretty serious threat. We talked about Pontiac's Rebellion. They wanted to be sure that they had soldiers there to deal with that. And so the problem is it's expensive. They came up with a plan. If we put the soldiers in homes, that will save some money. And so that was a proposal. The problem was the colonists, as you would imagine, would object to this because suddenly you have a British soldier or officer in your home all the time. You are responsible for feeding them, providing them a place to stay. You probably don't want a random person, particularly a British soldier, in your home. The British officers were notorious of how rude and condescending they were. So these are this is obviously going to be a big deal, and it's not going to last for very long. All right. The next attempt at taxation is the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act, as we've talked about before, was this small tax on printed materials. So what does that mean? If you bought a newspaper, there would be a stamp on it saying the tax had been paid and it could be sold. Same thing with any pamphlets or booklets or whatever. All right, so that seems pretty simple. It also included things like contracts and wedding licenses or marriage licenses, which the tax was considerably higher. So this tax was created to basically tax really the wealthy, right? We're talking like a penny tax on like a newspaper. The taxes on contracts were considerably higher. So, as is traditional American history, when there's a tax, we tend to object. So, what we see is a Stamp Act Congress. The wealthy elites of the colonies begin to object. They don't want the tax, they think it's unfair, and they start to lobby to the British Parliament. The British Parliament as part of their lobbying, they mentioned that we are not being represented. You're taxing us without representation, right? No taxation without representation. And so out of this comes the idea of virtual representation, which is the British basically say, you don't need representatives in Parliament. We will virtually represent you. We think of you and we consider you when we make decisions. That's not good enough for the colonists. But here's the thing: the Stamp Act will go away, right? As will the Sugar Act, is essentially go away. So in the first two attempts, the British to tax the colonists, that doesn't go anywhere. Now, out of this comes a new group called the Sons of Liberty. We talked about them as kind of basically a terrorist group. And the only reason they're not considered a terrorist group is because we won the war. If we had lost the war, they would be an insurgency, a terrorist group, no different than some of the groups that we're dealing with now. Now, here's the difference, right? Here's what they did. Let's talk about what they did. All right, start telling them, look at this picture right here, is that the Sons of Liberty, these gentlemen up here, the person you see here that looks like this has been what we call tarred and feathered. Essentially, they cover you in hot tar, which is going to hurt unbelievably bad, clog up your pores, and could very well kill you, and then they throw feathers on you. So this is an incredibly violent act. Who is this person supposed to represent? It is a tax collector. Tax collectors in the colonial period were basically colonists who took the job and could make a little bit extra money. They had to collect X amount in tax dollars and give it to the British government. So they would collect X plus a little bit of extra to pay themselves. Um, Obviously not particularly popular. And in case you weren't sure how violent these people were, the Sons of Liberty were, just look over here in the back corner. There's that little noose that kind of tells you that they were that violent. They did kill people. So they would tar and feather, they would harass, they would kill people, they would burn down property, they would vandalize property. Again, they're terrorists because they're essentially using violence and intimidation to bring about political change. Now, Sam Adams, the name we want to know here is that he is the founder of the Sons of Liberty, not to be confused with John Adams, who's also a patriot. While we're talking about this, let's just run through this. There are three groups we should know. There are patriots, moderates, and loyalists. Patriots are the people who are advocating for independence and harsh reactions to the British government. They're making up roughly a third of the population, third to 40%. Loyalists are people who are loyal to the crown. They tend to be older, they tend to be wealthier, they tend to be more connected to the British Empire in some way, maybe new immigrants from England. They want to stay. They're a small minority, 10%. And then everyone else in the middle is a moderate who looks at both sides and go, y'all crazy. All right, patriots are you're doing too much. The Sons of Liberty, you're a terrorist group. Meanwhile, they're looking at the loyalists going, you're just bending over and taking us. And why don't we fighting a little bit harder? We can find a middle ground. All right. So the colonies aren't even unified in this effort. There's a pretty significant stratification there. All right, now the British have tried already to tax us. Now they're coming up with a new one. I called this one in class the sneaky tax. All right, why is it a sneaky tax? Because it's on things that are manufactured goods from England, glass, lead, things of that nature, which are not allowed to be made in the colonies because the British want it made in England so they can make more money. So here's the reason it's sneaky. All right, you get taxed on these other things. The Stamp Act was obvious. You saw the stamp on the piece of paper. This is different. This is being taxed on the dock at the boat before it comes off into the harbor, right? Before it's being basically brought into stores. And so then the price just magically goes up to cover the tax. Here's the problem. You don't know whether you're being taxed. Well, it doesn't take too long for people to figure it out. And so the colonists come up with a solution. We just won't buy this stuff anymore. And so this is when we get the non-importation movement. Essentially, what that means is you are just going to basically make things yourself or find ways to live without whatever it is so that you can basically stick it to the British. The idea is that these are goods that you need us to buy. Well, we won't buy them anymore, and that means you're going to make no money. So either pull the tax off or go bankrupt. Now, the thing I want to mention about the non-importation movement really quickly and move on is that it was typically organized and executed by women. So when we start talking about what role women played in this revolution, they played a pretty significant role, certainly with this incident, with them basically being the ones running the household, deciding what's being bought and not bought. They played a real role in this, which is why later when Abigail Adams said, hey, don't forget the ladies when it comes time for independent or for rights, this is going to be one of the reasons they're going to be like, well, we did our job. Why aren't you helping us out? All right, Boston Massacre. Probably one of there's two major events I call American mythology from the time period. This is the first one. So a couple things. One, it's not really a massacre. A handful of people will be killed. That's it. The incident was basically caused by misbehaving British colonists who were throwing trash and snowballs and dirt and rocks at British soldiers who were there, stationed there to kind of be a police force. So this is all happening while it's happening, and then what winds up happening is Crispus Attucks, who is on your sheet, is the first victim, I suppose, of the American Revolution. He will supposedly grab the rifle of a British soldier, who will then open fire, which leads to all the other soldiers opening fire and leading to, again, about a handful of deaths. Not a huge massacre by any means. But here's the thing. Colonial newspapers begin to spin it as a massacre. And then later on, when there's an actual trial, these men are basically acquitted. They're not found guilty for their crime. And that only further induced rage among the colonists that they can gun us down the streets, but they don't have to deal with the consequences. All right, committees of correspondence. This is something we talked about as being this kind of early organization before we get to the first Continental Congress. People are beginning to write letters and pamphlets and newsletters and spreading them around the colonies to begin to share their ideas. So before there's any official meetings, this is the closest thing we get. So this would be like Twitter or email correspondence, basically between the people advocating for change. Even the moderates are involved in this because they want to have their voice heard. So this is kind of that we're beginning to see the organization stamp out. Congress was this. This is another example. We're building towards unity. Now, if there's an event that's probably more blown up in U.S. history than the Boston Massacre, it's the Boston Tea Party. So these gentlemen dressed up as Native Americans were members of Sons of Liberty. They got hammered from a pub or a tavern, decided they were going to go dump a bunch of tea in the harbor. So here's the thing. After Sully and Vinny decided to dump the tea in the harbor. Anyway, so here's the deal. The Boston Tea Party was what started was the British had imposed a new tax on tea. Now, obviously, every tax that had been imposed before had raised the price. The irony of all of this is that the price of tea actually fell because the British had worked out an exclusive trade deal with with a joint stock company who needed financial assistance. So the price of tea actually fell, and even with the tax included. So why are they flipping out? Why are they angry? Why are they doing all this? Well, it's kind of simple. They don't like being told what to do. That's just kind of America. Don't tell us what to do. Um, and also, the reality was they didn't like the idea that there wasn't going to be free trade. There would be a company that was getting favored status. Now, maybe the Boston Tea Party itself wasn't the bad part. It's the reaction. The reaction is pretty famous. This is a gotta know event here. The Intolerable Acts, right? It's basically all these provisions that get put down to basically clamp down and crush this uprising, I guess. So the first one, the Mass Government Act. Government, Massachusetts loses their governor, they lose their legislative body. The idea of self-rule we talked about from like Plymouth and Connecticut, all that is basically going to be wiped away because of this. The Quartering Act, that once removed act that said that you had to house soldiers, it's back again. They want British soldiers as a large presence in Massachusetts. And then not lastly, the Boston port gets closed. This was an attempt to basically make them pay for what they did with the tea, which was significant. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars. It wasn't a few $100 of tea. It wasn't like someone threw a tea bag. It was like 50 cents. No, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then lastly, the Administration of Justice Act. I mentioned this as the Murder Act. It basically said that British soldiers would not be tried in colonial courts, but by British military courts, which basically guarantees they're not going to get convicted of any crime they commit. So the issue here is the acts themselves aren't maybe that bad, but it's this notion that the colonists feel it's a gross overreaction, that they're being targeted, this is unfair. That is where why it's more significant. I think the British were frustrated and they acted, I guess, rashly. All right, First Continental Congress and Olive Branch Petition. First time the colonists get together and try to advocate to the crown, what they basically send off is the Olive Branch Petition, an attempt to go, whoa, 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 we're getting out of hand. That whole Intolerable Acts was too much. Can we chill out, relax? Let's just try to get back, rebuild our relationship. Here's the problem. The letter is ignored. The crown doesn't respond to it, which obviously is going to infuriate the colonists. They've tried, they suddenly tried to be reasonable where they've been basically unreasonable before. Now they're going to start to try to work with you. And the crown's like, no. So the real anger here is that they didn't even bother responding. Lexington and Concord, famous expression here is shot heard around the world. British soldiers march to Lexington and Concord to basically try to capture Sons of Liberty leaders and their weapons. They're met by what we call the Minutemen, a group of patriots who basically will stand toe-to-toe with the British military. The shot heard around the world is fired. That is supposedly what kickstarts the revolution. But the thing we want to get out of this is that the colonists, through the help of alcohol, begin to chase down the British military as they retreat back to Boston, and they're picking them off. They sustain essentially pretty heavy casualties, relatively speaking, but it builds this confidence that you can stand toe-to-toe with the British military and win, and that's the significant thing. Which brings us to the Second Continental Congress. All right, big thing we want to know about it is another meeting, but now we're being more aggressive. How aggressive are we going to be? Declaration of Independence. A couple things. To be clear, this does not make us free. We have to win the war to be free. This is just merely the breakup letter saying, screw you, here's what you did wrong, or out, right? This is where we start seeing some of the major ideas of the Enlightenment being written down and put forth. But mainly, this is like we're breaking up with you, and here are the very specific reasons we're breaking up with you. All right, and what helps spur this? Well, Lexington and Concord built confidence, but Common Sense by Thomas Paine also basically, right at this moment, we were feeling good, we felt confident, we think we can win. Here's this guy saying, you know what? We can break away. We have the right to break away. We should break away. And so all these factors will come together. for us to sign the Declaration of Independence. So I should probably have flipped these, but nonetheless, the whole idea is that Thomas Paine and Lexington Concord spur the Declaration of Independence. All right, see you next video.